Hello there, gentle souls, and welcome to another peaceful journey through the corridors of history. I'm so grateful you've chosen to join me tonight as we step back through time to one of humanity's darkest hours, yet also a time that revealed the brightest examples of human courage and compassion. Before we begin our journey to 1665 London, I'd love to know where in the world you're listening from tonight. Please drop a comment and let me know what draws you to these stories of ordinary people doing extraordinary things in the face of overwhelming challenges. And if you find comfort in these historical journeys, that subscribe button helps us create more peaceful adventures through time. Tonight, we're going to walk alongside Dr. Thomas Whitmore, a plague doctor in London during the Great Plague of 1665. But this isn't the terrifying tale of horror that popular culture often portrays. Instead, we'll discover the remarkable truth about these masked physicians, not harbingers of death, but heroes who risked everything to bring comfort, healing, and hope to families facing their darkest hours. The plague doctors of the 17th century have been misunderstood by history, their strange beaked masks and long robes making them seem like figures from nightmares. But the reality was far more inspiring than any myth. These were learned men who chose to remain in plague-stricken cities when others fled, who developed innovative treatments with limited knowledge, and who provided the only medical care available to thousands of suffering families. So let the worries of today fade away as we join Dr. Whitmore on a summer morning in 1665, when London was in the grip of its greatest health crisis, but also witnessing some of its greatest acts of human kindness. Close your eyes if you wish, and let your imagination carry you to cobblestone streets where church bells toll not just for the dead, but for the living who refuse to abandon their duty to heal. The first pale light of dawn creeps through the diamond-paned windows of Dr. Thomas Whitmore's modest house on Aldersgate Street, illuminating a room that serves as both study and armory in humanity's war against an invisible enemy. At 43, Thomas has practiced medicine in London for 18 years, but nothing in his training at Cambridge could have prepared him for the challenge that now defines every waking moment of his life. The Great Plague has been ravaging London for months now, arriving like an unwelcome visitor in the spring and settling in for what promises to be a deadly summer siege. The official death tolls, posted weekly by the parish clerks, tell only part of the story. By July of 1665, nearly 1,000 souls are perishing each week in the city, and Thomas knows the true numbers are likely far higher. Yet here he remains, one of perhaps 20 physicians who have chosen not to flee to the countryside with the wealthy families who can afford to escape. His decision to stay was not born of reckless bravery, but of quiet conviction. Someone must tend to the sick, and his oath as a physician binds him more surely than any chain. The room around him reflects both his scholarly nature and the grim realities of his current practice. Leather-bound medical texts share shelf space with bottles of vinegar, bundles of herbs, and the various remedies he has gathered from across Europe as reports of the plague's advance reached London months ago. On his desk, a letter from his colleague Dr. Giovanni Benedetti in Venice describes the protective measures used by Italian physicians, while another from Amsterdam details the latest theories about the disease's transmission. Thomas rises from his narrow bed. He has taken to sleeping in his study rather than the more comfortable chamber upstairs, wanting to remain close to his medical supplies should emergency calls arrive during the night. Such calls have become increasingly common as the plague tightens its grip on the city, and Thomas has learned to sleep lightly, always ready to answer the desperate knocks that echo through the pre-dawn darkness. The morning air carries scents that have become all too familiar. The acrid smoke from the fires that burn constantly throughout the city, consuming everything from infected clothing to entire houses where whole families have perished. But underneath the smoke, Thomas can still detect the sweeter aromas of the herb gardens that many citizens have planted, following the widespread belief that pleasant scents can ward off the corrupted air that spreads disease. His morning routine has evolved over the months of the plague into a careful ritual that balances medical preparation with what he privately acknowledges might be superstition. But in a time when learned physicians understand so little about the true nature of disease, the line between science and faith has become increasingly blurred. The water in his wash basin has been infused with rosemary and thyme, herbs that tradition claims can purify both body and spirit. As Thomas cleanses his face and hands with the aromatic mixture, he recites a prayer not for his own protection, but for wisdom to serve his patients well, despite the limitations of current medical knowledge. Thomas moves to the large wardrobe that dominates one wall of his study, its dark oak panels carved with symbols of medical learning. The rod of Asclepius, patron god of healing, intertwined with serpents that represent both poison and cure. Inside hang the specialized garments that have become his daily armor against the plague, each piece designed according to the latest theories about disease transmission and protection. The most striking element, of course, is the famous beaked mask that has made plague doctors instantly recognizable throughout European cities affected by the epidemic. Thomas lifts it carefully from its hook, examining the leather construction that a skilled craftsman in Southwark created according to specifications sent from physicians in Marseille. The mask's long beak serves a practical purpose that goes far beyond its intimidating appearance. The curved cavity can hold nearly a pound of aromatic substances, dried herbs, ground spices, fragments of precious stones, and other materials believed to purify the air before it reaches the physician's lungs. Thomas has experimented with different combinations over the months, currently favoring a mixture that includes rosemary for memory, thyme for courage, lavender for peace, and powdered unicorn horn for its legendary healing properties. The eyepieces, made of clear crystal, provide surprisingly good vision while creating a barrier against airborne contamination. Thomas has learned to read his patients' expressions through these lenses, detecting subtle signs of improvement or decline that might escape a physician's notice under normal circumstances. The mask's design also serves an important psychological function, though Thomas is only beginning to understand this aspect of his work. The strange bird-like appearance creates an impression of otherworldly authority that can be comforting to patients who feel abandoned by more conventional medical care. When families see the distinctive silhouette of a plague doctor approaching their door, they know that someone with knowledge and dedication has come to help, even if that help might prove limited. Thomas carefully fills the beak with his chosen mixture of aromatics, testing the seal around the mouth opening to ensure no contaminated air can penetrate his defenses. The ritual has become meditative, each step performed with the precision of a priest preparing for sacred ceremony. Next comes the great leather coat that extends from his neck to his ankles, its surface treated with oils and waxes that are believed to repel the corrupt vapors that carry disease. The coat's weight, nearly 10 pounds of thick leather and metal fittings, requires considerable strength to wear for the long hours of his daily rounds. but Thomas has grown accustomed to moving within what he privately thinks of as his mobile fortress. The coat's design reflects both practical and theoretical considerations. Its dark color is intended to make the doctor a less prominent target for the desperate or deranged citizens who sometimes blame physicians for the plague's spread. The full-length coverage protects against physical contact with infected patients, while the tight-fitting cuffs and collar create additional barriers against airborne contamination. Underneath the leather coat, Thomas wears a full-length linen gown that can be removed and burned if it becomes contaminated during his work. This inner garment, blessed by the rector of St. Giles Cripplegate, provides what he hopes is both physical and spiritual protection against the forces of disease and death. Thomas turns his attention to the leather satchel that will accompany him throughout the day, carefully checking each instrument and remedy to ensure he carries everything necessary for his patient's care. The bag itself, crafted by the same artisan who made his protective coat, features multiple compartments designed to organize his medical supplies while preventing cross-contamination between different treatments. His surgical instruments, though limited by the standards of later centuries, represent the finest medical technology available in 1665. A set of lancets for bloodletting, believed essential for rebalancing the body's humors during illness. A collection of cupping vessels for drawing corrupted blood to the surface where it can be safely removed. Several sizes of syringes for administering medicines and cleaning wounds. The medicines Thomas carries reflect both ancient tradition and cutting-edge innovation. Theriac, the legendary cure-all that contains more than 60 ingredients, including viper's flesh, has been prepared according to a recipe that dates back to ancient Rome. Venice treacle, a similar compound with a reputation for effectiveness against poison, represents the latest pharmaceutical thinking from Italy's leading medical centers. More practical remedies fill other compartments of his bag. Tincture of opium for pain relief, prepared from poppies grown in monastery gardens outside London. Willow bark extract for reducing fever, a remedy he learned from Dutch physicians who corresponded with colleagues in the Americas. Various purgatives and emetics for cleansing the body of corrupted humors, though Thomas has grown increasingly skeptical of treatments that further weaken already suffering patients. His collection of herbs represents a botanical pharmacy that would impress any apothecary in Europe. Feverfew for reducing temperature, chamomile for calming anxiety, echinacea for strengthening the body's natural defenses against disease. Many of these remedies come from his own garden, carefully tended despite the chaos surrounding the city, where Thomas has attempted to recreate the medicinal gardens he studied during his university training. But perhaps the most important items in Thomas's medical arsenal are not medicines at all, but the tools of observation and record-keeping that allow him to study the plague's progression and develop more effective treatments. A brass-bound notebook, its pages covered with careful observations about symptoms, treatments, and outcomes. A set of measuring devices for tracking pulse rate, breathing patterns, and other vital signs that might reveal important information about the disease's progression. Thomas has begun to suspect that careful observation might prove more valuable than the traditional remedies he learned during his medical training. The plague seems to follow patterns that resist conventional treatment, but these patterns might yield valuable information to a physician willing to look beyond established doctrine. A small vial of mercury, sealed with wax and wrapped in silk, represents one of his most controversial treatments. Some European physicians have reported success using mercury preparations against the plague, though Thomas remains cautious about employing such a dangerous remedy, except in the most desperate cases. Before donning his protective equipment and venturing into the plague-stricken streets, Thomas kneels before a small shrine that occupies a corner of his study. The shrine reflects both his Christian faith and his medical vocation. A crucifix carved from oak taken from Canterbury Cathedral shares space with an image of Saint Luke, patron saint of physicians, and a small relic said to contain fragments of bone from Saint Roch, who devoted his life to caring for plague victims. Thomas's morning prayers have evolved during the months of the epidemic, becoming less focused on personal protection and more concerned with the wisdom and strength necessary to serve his patients effectively. He prays not that he might avoid infection. Such prayers seem almost selfish when thousands of innocent families face the plague daily, but that he might bring genuine comfort and healing to those who have nowhere else to turn. Grant me the knowledge to heal where healing is possible, he whispers, his voice barely audible in the quiet study. Grant me the wisdom to provide comfort where healing is not possible, and grant me the courage to remain present with those who face their final hours, that no one might die alone and forgotten. The prayer reflects Thomas's growing understanding that his role as a plague doctor extends far beyond the administration of medicines and surgical procedures. In a city where traditional social structures have collapsed under the weight of epidemic disease, he has become counselor, priest, and witness to human suffering on a scale that challenges his deepest beliefs about divine providence and human resilience. He has seen entire families perish within days of each other, leaving behind empty houses that stand as monuments to lives cut short by forces beyond human understanding. He has watched strong men reduced to helpless children by fever and delirium, calling out for mothers who died decades ago. He has held the hands of dying women who begged him to promise that their children would be cared for, knowing that those children were likely already infected and beyond any earthly help. Yet Thomas has also witnessed remarkable examples of human courage and compassion that strengthen his faith in ways that no theological argument could achieve. Neighbors who risk infection to care for orphaned children. Merchants who donate their wealth to provide food for quarantined families. Clergymen who remain at their posts to provide spiritual comfort even as their own parishes are decimated by disease. His final prayer, spoken while holding a small silver cross that belonged to his late wife Margaret, asks for protection not for himself, but for all those whose lives will intersect with his during the coming day. Margaret died 3 years ago of a fever that bore no resemblance to the plague, but Thomas still feels her presence during these morning devotions, still draws strength from her memory of selfless service to others. With his spiritual preparation complete, Thomas begins the physical transformation that will convert him from a vulnerable human being into the distinctive figure that has become both feared and welcomed throughout plague-stricken London. The process has become ritualistic, each step performed with the precision of a knight donning armor before battle. First comes the linen undergarment, blessed by holy water and sewn with prayers written on tiny strips of parchment. The garment covers him from neck to ankles, creating the first barrier between his skin and any contamination he might encounter during his rounds. Thomas has learned to appreciate the psychological comfort provided by this blessed clothing. While he cannot be certain of its physical protection, The spiritual reassurance helps maintain the calm confidence that his patients need to see. The great leather coat comes next, its weight settling across his shoulders like a familiar burden. Thomas has grown accustomed to moving within this mobile fortress, learning to navigate narrow staircases and crowded rooms despite the coat's bulk and weight. The leather has been treated with a mixture of oils and waxes that create a waterproof barrier while maintaining enough flexibility for the physical demands of medical practice. The coat's numerous pockets contain specialized equipment for different aspects of his work. Instruments for surgical procedures in one section, medicines for common ailments in another, emergency supplies for unexpected situations in a third. Thomas has organized these contents through months of experience, developing a system that allows him to locate any necessary item quickly, even while wearing the limiting eyepieces of his mask. Thick leather gloves complete the protective barrier, their inner surfaces treated with herbal preparations that are believed to neutralize any contamination that might penetrate the outer defenses. The gloves extend well up his forearms, overlapping with the coat's sleeves to ensure no gap in protection. Thomas has learned to perform delicate medical procedures while wearing these cumbersome protections, developing a sensitivity of touch that compensates for the reduced tactile feedback. Finally comes the famous beaked mask, its leather straps adjusted to create a perfect seal around his face. The aromatic mixture within the beak immediately fills his senses with the familiar scents of herbs and spices, creating an olfactory barrier between Thomas and the often overwhelming odors he will encounter during his work. The plague produces distinctive smells that can be detected from considerable distances: the sweetish scent of fever, the acrid odor of infected wounds, the unmistakable smell of approaching death. The mask's eyepieces reduce his peripheral vision while magnifying sounds in unexpected ways. Thomas has learned to rely more heavily on his hearing during patient examinations, detecting subtle changes in breathing patterns or heart rhythms that might escape notice under normal circumstances. The mask also changes his voice, giving it a hollow, otherworldly quality that some patients find comforting and others find terrifying. As Thomas completes his transformation into the plague doctor, he catches sight of himself in the polished metal mirror that hangs beside his wardrobe. The figure that looks back barely resembles the Thomas Whitmore who woke in this same room just an hour ago. Instead, he sees the distinctive silhouette that has become one of the most recognizable images in plague-stricken Europe: the long black coat, the bizarre beaked mask, the leather-gloved hands that carry both healing and the possibility of contamination. But Thomas has learned to see beyond the frightening exterior to the human purpose that drives his work. Underneath the protective equipment, he remains a physician committed to healing, a scholar dedicated to understanding, a human being determined to serve others despite the personal risks involved. The costume may make him appear inhuman, but it serves ultimately human purposes: the preservation of life, the relief of suffering, the maintenance of hope in the face of overwhelming despair. As church bells throughout London begin tolling the hour, some calling the faithful to morning prayer, others marking the deaths that have occurred during the night, Thomas picks up his medical bag and moves toward the door. The day's work awaits, and somewhere in the plague-stricken city, families are depending on him to bring whatever healing knowledge and human compassion he can offer. The transformation is complete. Dr. Thomas Whitmore has become the plague doctor, ready to walk once again into the streets where death and healing wage their daily battle for the souls of London. The morning air hits Thomas like a physical presence as he steps from his house onto Aldersgate Street, the familiar weight of his protective equipment immediately reminding him of the dangerous world beyond his door. London, in July 1665, bears little resemblance to the bustling metropolis he has known and loved for nearly 2 decades. The city's normal symphony of commerce and conversation has been replaced by an eerie quiet, broken only by the distant sound of church bells, the rumble of death carts, and the occasional cry of "Bring out your dead" that echoes through the narrow streets. Red crosses mark the doors of infected houses throughout the neighborhood, painted symbols that warn healthy citizens to avoid these dwellings while identifying homes where Thomas's services are desperately needed. The sight of these crosses never fails to move him. Each one represents a family facing their greatest trial, people who have watched their normal lives dissolve into fear, isolation, and often grief. His first call takes him 3 streets over to a modest timber-framed house where the Hartwell family has been confined for nearly a week. Thomas received word yesterday evening that young William Hartwell, age 8, had developed the telltale symptoms that marked the plague's onset: high fever, severe headache, and the beginning of the swollen lymph nodes that give the disease its popular name of bubonic plague. The house stands silent as Thomas approaches, its red cross still fresh enough to show the paint's original brightness. 2 armed watchmen, employed by the parish to enforce quarantine regulations, nod respectfully as they recognize the distinctive figure of the plague doctor. These men face their own dangers. Close daily contact with infected households makes them among the most likely candidates for infection themselves, but their presence ensures that quarantine measures are properly maintained. "Morning, Doctor," calls Robert Fletcher, the senior watchman whose weather-beaten face shows the strain of weeks spent guarding contaminated houses. "The boy took a turn for the worse during the night, according to his mother. She's been calling for you since before dawn." Thomas nods his acknowledgement, his voice muffled by the leather mask as he responds. "Have any other family members shown symptoms?" "Not yet, sir, but the mother looks poorly enough. Haven't seen the father or the older children since yesterday." The implications hang heavy in the morning air. In Thomas's experience, the plague rarely strikes just one member of a household. The disease seems to spread through families with devastating efficiency, often claiming multiple victims within days of the first infection. His role is not just to treat the obvious patient, but to monitor and hopefully protect those who remain healthy. Thomas approaches the house's front door, noting the details that have become second nature during months of such visits. The windows are tightly shuttered according to official guidelines, based on the theory that contaminated air spreads the disease. A bucket of vinegar sits beside the door. Families have been instructed to use it for purifying any items that must pass between the infected house and the outside world. He knocks with the distinctive pattern that identifies him as an official plague doctor rather than a curious neighbor or opportunistic thief. The response comes immediately. Clearly, the family has been listening for his arrival. "Dr. Whitmore?" The voice belongs to Sarah Hartwell, William's mother, and Thomas can hear the strain of sleepless nights and desperate worry in those 2 words. "Yes, Mrs. Hartwell. I've come to examine William and check on the rest of your family." The door opens just wide enough to admit him. and Thomas steps into a world that has become all too familiar during his plague rounds. The house's interior is dim, with only a few candles providing light since the shuttered windows block most natural illumination. The air carries the distinctive scents he has learned to associate with plague-stricken households: burning herbs, vinegar, the sweetish smell of fever, and underneath it all, the odor of fear. Sarah Hartwell looks as though she has aged years in the week since Thomas last saw her at Sunday market. Her normally neat brown hair hangs loose around her shoulders, and her dress shows the wrinkles and stains that accumulate when normal domestic routines become impossible. But her eyes still show the fierce determination of a mother fighting to protect her child. "He's upstairs, doctor. The fever came back worse than ever around midnight, and he's been asking for you." Thomas follows Sarah up the narrow wooden staircase to the family sleeping chamber, where 8-year-old William lies on a small bed, positioned near the room's single window. Even through the filtered air of his protective mask, Thomas can detect the smell of sickness that surrounds the child, a combination of fever, infection, and the herbal remedies that Sarah has been applying according to the instructions Thomas provided during his previous visit. Young William presents a textbook case of bubonic plague in its early stages, though Thomas has learned never to assume that any case will follow a predictable course. The boy's fever has clearly spiked during the night, leaving his face flushed and his hair damp with perspiration. His breathing comes in short, shallow gasps that suggest the beginning of respiratory complications, while his eyes show the glassy appearance that often accompanies high fever. But it's the swollen lymph nodes, the buboes that give this form of plague its name, that provide the clearest indication of William's condition. The nodes in his neck have grown noticeably larger since Thomas's last visit, creating visible lumps that are clearly causing the boy considerable pain. Thomas has learned to evaluate these swellings carefully, as their size, consistency, and rate of growth can provide important clues about the infection's progress. "Hello, William," Thomas says gently, kneeling beside the bed despite the awkwardness of his protective equipment. "How are you feeling this morning?" The boy's response comes in a whisper that Thomas must strain to hear through his mask. "My neck hurts, doctor, and I'm so hot, but mother keeps putting blankets on me." Thomas glances at Sarah, who hovers anxiously nearby. The conflict between patient comfort and prescribed treatment represents one of the many dilemmas he faces daily. Medical theory suggests that sweating can help purge the corrupted humors that cause disease, but common sense argues that an already suffering child should not be made more uncomfortable by unnecessary blankets. "Let's see if we can make you more comfortable," Thomas tells William, gently removing one of the heavy woolen covers. The boy's immediate sigh of relief provides more useful information than many formal diagnostic procedures. Thomas begins his examination with the careful attention to detail that has become his trademark during the plague months. He checks William's pulse, noting that it remains rapid but regular, a good sign that suggests the boy's heart is still strong enough to fight the infection. His breathing, while labored, doesn't yet show the extreme difficulty that marks the plague's final stages. The examination of the buboes requires particular care, as these swollen lymph nodes are both the disease's most characteristic symptom and often the key to understanding its progression. Thomas has developed techniques for assessing these swellings without causing unnecessary pain, using gentle pressure to evaluate their consistency and warmth while watching the patient's face for signs of discomfort. William's buboes, show the characteristics that Thomas has learned to associate with potentially recoverable cases. While clearly enlarged and tender, they remain relatively soft to the touch and show no signs of the blackening that often indicates more serious complications. The skin around them appears inflamed but not necrotic, suggesting that the boy's body is mounting an effective immune response. "The swelling is about what I expected," Thomas tells Sarah, speaking loud enough for her to hear clearly through his mask. "William's body is fighting the infection, which is exactly what we want to see." But Thomas's examination reveals other symptoms that concern him more than the obvious buboes. William's temperature, while high, fluctuates in patterns that suggest complications beyond simple fever. His complaints of headache and neck stiffness might indicate that the infection is affecting his nervous system, a development that Thomas has observed in several cases that ultimately proved fatal. Most troubling, William shows signs of the delirium that often accompanies severe plague infections. The boy speaks coherently when directly addressed, but Thomas notices that his eyes sometimes focus on things that aren't present in the room, and he occasionally responds to voices that only he can hear. Thomas opens his medical bag and begins selecting the treatments that experience has taught him offer the best hope for plague patients in William's condition. But he does so with the humility of a physician who has learned that medical knowledge in 1665 remains painfully limited, and that sometimes the most important service he can provide is simply the comfort of professional attention and human presence. The first priority is reducing William's fever, which has clearly spiked to dangerous levels during the night. Thomas prepares a mixture of willow bark extract and chamomile tea, both remedies that he has found helpful in lowering body temperature while providing some pain relief for the swollen lymph nodes. The preparation must be done carefully, as overdosing feverish patients with herbal medicines can create complications worse than the original symptoms. This should help with the fever and make the swelling in his neck less painful. Thomas explains to Sarah as he measures the proper dosage. Give him small sips every hour, but don't force him to drink if he becomes nauseous. The treatment of buboes themselves presents more challenging decisions. Medical theory suggests that drawing the corrupted humors to the surface of the body can help eliminate the infection, but Thomas has grown increasingly skeptical of treatments that seem to weaken patients who are already fighting for their lives. Instead, he prepares a poultice made from herbs that he believes can reduce inflammation while providing some pain relief. This will help with the swelling, he tells Sarah as he applies the warm herbal mixture to William's neck. The important thing is to keep him as comfortable as possible while his body fights the infection. But Thomas knows that the treatments he can offer address only the symptoms of plague, not its underlying cause. The disease itself remains a mystery that defies the medical theories he learned during his university training. None of the traditional approaches, bloodletting, purging, the rebalancing of bodily humors, seem to have any significant effect on the plague's progression. What Thomas has observed, however, is that patients who receive careful nursing care, adequate nutrition, and emotional support seem to have better survival rates than those who are simply given medicines and left alone. This observation has led him to spend as much time instructing family members in patient care as he does administering formal medical treatments. Thomas tells Sarah, "The most important thing you can do for William is to keep him clean and comfortable," as he demonstrates proper techniques for bathing a feverish patient. cool water for washing, clean bedding changed regularly, and small amounts of nourishing food whenever he can keep it down. Thomas also provides Sarah with supplies that, while not strictly medical, can make an enormous difference in William's recovery prospects. Clean linen for changing bed sheets, soap made with herbs believed to have antiseptic properties, and a collection of simple foods, broths, mild teas, easily digested fruits that can help maintain the boy's strength during his illness. "What about the rest of the family?" Sarah asks, her voice carrying the fear that Thomas hears in every plague household. "My husband is showing no symptoms, but he's been caring for William, and my 2 older children have been confined to the house with us." This question strikes at the heart of Thomas's most difficult responsibilities as a plague doctor. While he can offer treatments for those already infected, preventing the disease's spread within households has proven nearly impossible. The plague seems to move through families according to its own mysterious logic, sometimes sparing individuals who have close contact with infected patients while striking down others who seem safely isolated. Thomas moves with Sarah to the family's main room, where he can speak more privately about the difficult realities that plague brings to every household it touches. This conversation represents one of the most important aspects of his work, providing families with honest information about what they can expect while helping them maintain hope and take practical steps to protect themselves. "Your husband and older children show no symptoms yet, which is encouraging," Thomas begins, choosing his words carefully. "But we must be realistic about the risks they face. The plague spreads easily within households, and we don't fully understand how to prevent that transmission." Sarah's face shows the strain of a mother trying to protect multiple children while caring for one who is already desperately ill. "Should I try to separate them? Send the healthy ones away?" Thomas has wrestled with this question in dozens of households, and his answer reflects both medical uncertainty and practical realities. If you have relatives outside London who could take them, that might be safest. But travel itself carries risks, and many communities won't accept refugees from plague-stricken cities. The conversation that follows illustrates the impossible choices that plague forces upon ordinary families. Sarah's husband works as a carpenter, and his skills are desperately needed in a city where so many buildings require repair or modification for quarantine purposes. Their older children, Anne, age 12, and Thomas, age 10, attend a local school that has remained open despite the epidemic, providing them with education and some sense of normal routine. "We've talked about sending the children to my sister in Oxford," Sarah admits, "but travel requires official permits, and we don't know if they're already infected but not showing symptoms yet." Thomas nods, recognizing the dilemma that has torn apart countless families during the plague months. "What does your husband think?" "He believes we should stay together as a family, whatever happens. He says that if God means to take us, at least we'll face it together." The religious dimension of plague response represents another area where Thomas must navigate carefully between his medical training and the spiritual needs of his patients. While he cannot share the simple faith that sustains many plague victims, he has learned to respect the comfort that religious belief provides and to work within that framework whenever possible. "Your husband's instincts may be right," Thomas tells Sarah. "Families that support each other often do better than those that are separated by fear. William needs you both, and your other children need the security of familiar faces during this frightening time." Thomas provides Sarah with detailed instructions for monitoring her family members for early signs of plague infection. The initial symptoms, fever, headache, general malaise, can be subtle and might be mistaken for less serious illnesses. But early recognition and treatment offer the best hope for survival, making family vigilance an essential part of plague prevention. He also shares practical advice for reducing transmission within the household. Frequent hand washing with soap and hot water, regular cleaning of surfaces with vinegar solutions, and careful disposal of any materials that might carry infection. While Thomas cannot be certain that these measures actually prevent plague transmission, they provide families with constructive activities that help combat the sense of helplessness that can be as destructive as the disease itself. Most importantly, Thomas emphasizes, "Don't hesitate to send for me if anyone else develops symptoms." The earlier we can begin treatment, the better the chances for recovery. As Thomas prepares to leave the Hartwell house and continue his rounds, he takes a moment to discuss with Sarah the broader changes that plague has brought to their community. These conversations serve multiple purposes. They help families understand that their struggles are shared by neighbors throughout the city. They provide Thomas with information about community conditions that might affect his medical practice, and they maintain social connections that can be crucial for long-term recovery from the epidemic. "How are the neighbors managing?" Thomas asks as Sarah walks him to the door. "Are people helping each other, or has fear driven everyone into isolation?" Sarah's answer reflects the complex mix of human responses that Thomas has observed throughout plague-stricken London. Some families have been wonderful. The Millers next door bring us food and medicines, and Mrs. Cooper down the street has offered to care for our healthy children if needed. But others won't even acknowledge us when we call from our windows. This division within communities represents one of plague's most tragic effects. The disease not only kills individuals, but also destroys the social bonds that make neighborhoods into genuine communities. Fear of infection has led many citizens to abandon traditional obligations of mutual support, while others have responded to the crisis by intensifying their commitment to helping neighbors in need. Thomas has seen both extremes during his months of plague work. He has encountered families who risked their own lives to care for orphan neighborhood children, and others who refused to provide basic assistance to longtime friends facing desperate circumstances. The epidemic has revealed both the best and worst aspects of human nature, often within the same communities and sometimes within the same individuals. The important thing is to maintain whatever connections you can, Thomas tells Sarah. The families that do best during plague outbreaks are those that don't become completely isolated from their neighbors. Thomas also inquires about the availability of essential supplies in their neighborhood: food, medicines, fuel for heating and cooking. The plague has disrupted normal commercial activities throughout London, creating shortages that can be as dangerous as the disease itself for families already weakened by illness and confinement. "We're managing for now," Sarah reports, "but prices have gone up terribly, and some goods are almost impossible to find. The apothecary's shop has been closed for weeks. No one knows if the owner fled the city or fell victim to the plague himself." These supply disruptions represent another aspect of Thomas's work that extends far beyond traditional medical practice. He has become an informal coordinator of community resources, helping families locate needed supplies while identifying households that might require charitable assistance. His daily rounds provide him with unique knowledge of neighborhood conditions making him a valuable source of information for parish officials trying to maintain some semblance of normal civic services. As Thomas takes his leave from the Hartwell house, promising to return the following day to check on William's progress, he carries with him not just the medical observations that will guide his treatment decisions, but also the human stories that remind him why his work matters despite its dangers and limitations. The morning sun has climbed higher as Thomas emerges onto the street, its rays filtering through the smoke that perpetually hangs over London during these plague months. The city's normal rhythms have been replaced by the slower, more cautious movements of a population living under siege. Yet life continues, adapted to new realities but not entirely defeated by them. His next call awaits just 3 streets away, where another family faces their own battle against the plague. But Thomas carries with him the quiet satisfaction of knowing that young William Hartwell showed signs of improvement during his visit, a small victory in humanity's larger war against forces that remain beyond full understanding or control. Thomas's route through the plague-stricken city takes him past the shop of Master Edmund Culpeper, one of the few apothecaries who has remained in London throughout the epidemic. Unlike many merchants who fled to the countryside at the first reports of disease, Culpeper has transformed his establishment into an essential resource for the physicians, surgeons, and wise women who continue to battle the plague despite inadequate knowledge and limited supplies. The shop's exterior bears the same red cross that marks infected houses, but in this case, the symbol indicates not contagion, but service. Culpeper has painted the cross voluntarily to signal that his establishment remains open specifically to serve plague victims and their caregivers. The windows, usually filled with displays of colorful medicines and exotic remedies, now show notices written in both English and Latin, advertising the availability of specific treatments and requesting information about effective remedies from any physician willing to share his knowledge. Thomas pushes open the heavy wooden door, its brass fittings polished despite the chaos that surrounds the city. The familiar scent of herbs, minerals, and chemical preparations immediately fills his nostrils, even through the aromatic mixture in his plague mask. This shop has become a sanctuary where the normal rules of commercial competition have been suspended in favor of collaborative efforts to find effective treatments for humanity's greatest medical challenge. Dr. Whitmore. Culpeper's voice carries genuine pleasure as he recognizes his visitor. At 56, the apothecary has spent more than 3 decades studying the properties of medicines, and his expertise has become invaluable during the plague months. I've been hoping you would visit today. I've received correspondence from physicians in Amsterdam that describes some promising new treatments. The collaboration between physicians and apothecaries represents one of the few positive developments to emerge from the plague crisis. Traditional boundaries between different medical practitioners have blurred as the epidemic's severity has forced all healers to share knowledge and resources. Thomas has learned as much about effective treatments from conversations with experienced apothecaries as from his formal medical training. Culpeper leads Thomas to the back room of his shop, where a large table serves as both workspace and conference area for the informal network of medical practitioners who meet regularly to share observations and coordinate their efforts. The table's surface is covered with letters from physicians throughout Europe, samples of medicines that have shown promise in other plague-stricken cities, and careful notes documenting the results of various treatments attempted in London. The Dutch physicians report significant success with a mercury-based preparation, Culpeper explains. handling a small vial with obvious respect for its potentially dangerous contents. They claim it can reduce the size of buboes when applied externally, though they acknowledge the risks involved in using such a powerful remedy. Thomas examines the vial carefully, weighing the potential benefits against the known dangers of mercury poisoning. His medical training has taught him to be extremely cautious with remedies that can harm patients even when properly administered, and mercury represents one of the most dangerous substances available to physicians. "What about the patients who receive this treatment?" Thomas asks. "Do we have detailed reports about their recovery rates?" Culpepper produces a letter written in the precise Latin of formal medical correspondence, its pages filled with careful observations about dosages, application methods, and patient outcomes. The document represents exactly the kind of systematic approach to treatment that Thomas believes offers humanity's best hope for developing effective responses to epidemic disease. The letter describes 23 plague patients who received mercury treatments over a period of 6 weeks. 11 showed significant improvement in their symptoms. 8 showed no change, and 4 died despite the treatment. While these results are hardly conclusive, they suggest that mercury might indeed offer benefits for certain patients under specific circumstances. "I've prepared a diluted version that should be safer for external application," Culpepper explains, showing Thomas a preparation that appears much less concentrated than the original Dutch formula. "Would you be willing to try it with some of your patients, assuming they provide informed consent?" This question strikes at the heart of the ethical dilemmas that plague physicians face daily. How can a doctor balance the potential benefits of experimental treatments against the risks of making already suffering patients worse? Thomas has wrestled with these questions throughout the epidemic, developing guidelines that he hopes protect patients while allowing for the medical innovations that might eventually control the disease. Thomas's second stop of the morning takes him to St. Bartholomew's Hospital, where Dr. Richard Mead has established what amounts to London's first systematic research program for plague treatment. Unlike most medical practitioners who work in isolation, Mead has created a collaborative environment where physicians, surgeons, and other healers can share observations and test new approaches under controlled conditions. The hospital's plague ward occupies a separate building specifically constructed to isolate infected patients while providing them with the best available medical care. The facility's design reflects the latest theories about disease transmission: high ceilings to promote air circulation, large windows that can be opened to prevent the accumulation of corrupted vapors, and specialized areas for different types of treatment. Dr. Mead greets Thomas in the hospital's consultation room, where a group of physicians meets each morning to discuss their patients' conditions and plan treatment strategies. At 38, Mead has already established himself as one of London's most innovative medical practitioners, combining traditional approaches with experimental methods that push the boundaries of current knowledge. "Thomas, I'm glad you're here," Mead says, gesturing toward a wall covered with detailed charts tracking the symptoms and treatments of more than 200 plague patients. "We've been analyzing the patterns we're seeing, and I believe we're beginning to understand some important aspects of how this disease progresses." The charts represent a revolutionary approach to medical record keeping, with each patient's case documented in detail that would have been unimaginable before the plague crisis forced physicians to develop new methods for managing large numbers of similar cases. Thomas studies the information with the fascination of a scholar discovering a new field of knowledge. "What patterns are you seeing?" Thomas asks, noting that the charts include not just symptom progression, but also detailed information about treatments, outcomes, and the environmental conditions under which patients were cared for. Mead points to a series of entries that show remarkably similar progressions in patients who received care during the early stages of their infections. Patients who begin treatment within the first day or two of symptom onset show significantly better survival rates than those who don't receive care until the disease is more advanced. This suggests that early intervention might be crucial for successful treatment. This observation aligns with Thomas's own experience, though he has never had the opportunity to analyze such a large collection of cases. The implication that plague might be more treatable than previously believed if caught early could revolutionize approaches to epidemic management. We've also discovered that certain combinations of treatments seem more effective than any single remedy used alone. Mead continues, showing Thomas detailed notes about various therapeutic approaches. Patients who receive both herbal fever reducers and external applications for their buboes recover at higher rates than those who receive only one type of treatment. The conversation that follows illustrates the kind of systematic thinking that Thomas believes represents medicine's future. Rather than relying solely on traditional remedies or theoretical approaches, Mead and his colleagues are developing treatments based on careful observation of what actually works for real patients under controlled conditions. Thomas shares his own observations from months of plague rounds, contributing to the growing database of information that might eventually lead to more effective treatments. He describes cases where patients recovered despite having severe symptoms, others where seemingly mild infections proved fatal, and the environmental factors that seem to influence recovery rates. I've noticed that patients who maintain adequate nutrition during their illness seem to recover more frequently, Thomas reports. Families that can provide broths, mild foods, and clean water have better outcomes than those where patients become severely dehydrated or malnourished. This observation prompts a discussion about the importance of supportive care, treatments that don't directly address the plague infection, but help patients maintain the strength necessary to fight the disease. Thomas has become convinced that nursing care might be as important as specific medicines in determining patient outcomes. The afternoon brings Thomas to one of his most challenging cases, a merchant named Jeffrey Whitehead, whose plague infection has progressed to the point where surgical intervention may offer the only hope for survival. Whitehead's buboes have grown to enormous size and show signs of internal infection that threatens to spread throughout his body if not addressed quickly. The decision to attempt surgery on a plague patient never comes easily. The procedures available in 1665 are crude by later standards, and operating on patients already weakened by disease carries enormous risks. But Thomas has learned that some cases present situations where surgical intervention, despite its dangers, offers better prospects than allowing the infection to progress unchecked. Whitehead's case presents exactly this kind of difficult choice. The merchant's buboes have reached a size that interferes with normal breathing and swallowing, while their rapid growth suggests that the infection is spreading faster than his body can mount an effective immune response. Without intervention, Thomas believes the patient will die within days. With surgery, he might survive, or the procedure itself might kill him. The surgery takes place in Whitehead's own home, following Thomas's standard practice of avoiding hospital environments where multiple infections can complicate individual cases. The merchant's family has prepared a room according to Thomas's instructions, cleaned thoroughly with vinegar solutions, supplied with clean linen and sterilized instruments, and arranged to provide the best possible lighting for delicate work. Thomas's surgical technique reflects both his formal training and the innovations he has developed during months of plague practice. The incision must be large enough to drain the infected material that has accumulated within the swollen lymph nodes, but not so large as to create additional sites for infection. The procedure requires steady hands, perfect concentration, and the ability to work quickly while maintaining surgical precision. The important thing is to remain perfectly still, Thomas tells Whitehead as he prepares to begin the procedure. I'm going to give you something for the pain, but you'll need to stay conscious so you can tell me if you experience any unusual sensations. The pain medication, a tincture of opium mixed with wine, represents one of the few truly effective treatments available to 17th century physicians. While the remedy cannot eliminate the pain of surgery entirely, it can reduce suffering to tolerable levels while allowing patients to remain alert enough to participate in their own care. The surgery itself proceeds with the methodical precision that Thomas has developed through months of similar procedures. The initial incision releases a quantity of infected material that confirms his diagnosis while providing immediate relief from the pressure that has been interfering with Whitehead's breathing. But the procedure also reveals the extent of internal infection that has accompanied the external swelling. "This is what I was afraid of," Thomas murmurs as he continues working. The infection has spread deeper than the external symptoms suggested. The discovery requires Thomas to extend the surgical procedure beyond what he had originally planned, removing infected tissue that threatens to spread the disease to other parts of Whitehead's body. The additional work increases both the potential benefits and the risks of the operation, forcing Thomas to make moment-by-moment decisions about how aggressively to pursue the infection without killing the patient through excessive surgical trauma. Throughout the procedure, Thomas maintains the careful observation that has become his trademark during plague cases. He monitors Whitehead's pulse, breathing, and general condition, watching for signs that the patient is approaching the limits of what his weakened body can endure. The balance between effective treatment and patient safety requires constant vigilance and the willingness to stop the procedure if circumstances change. As Thomas completes the surgical procedure and begins the delicate process of wound care that will determine whether Whitehead survives the operation, he reflects on how his understanding of healing has evolved during the plague months. The epidemic has taught him that effective medical care extends far beyond the administration of medicines or the performance of surgical procedures. The psychological aspects of plague treatment have proven as important as any physical intervention. Patients who maintain hope and receive emotional support from family members consistently show better recovery rates than those who face their illness in isolation or despair. Thomas has learned to spend significant time during each visit addressing his patients' fears and helping them maintain the mental state that supports physical healing. The surgery went well, Thomas tells Whitehead as he applies the herbal poultices that will help prevent infection in the surgical wound. "Your body responded exactly as we hoped, and I believe we've removed the source of the most dangerous infection. Now your job is to rest and let your body complete the healing process." The reassurance serves multiple purposes. It provides Whitehead with accurate information about his condition while encouraging the positive mental attitude that Thomas believes can influence recovery outcomes. But Thomas also uses these conversations to educate patients about the healing process, helping them understand what to expect during recovery and how they can contribute to their own treatment. Thomas's approach to wound care reflects both traditional techniques and innovations he has developed through plague experience. The herbal poultices contain substances believed to prevent infection while promoting healing. Honey for its antiseptic properties, comfrey for tissue repair, and various aromatic herbs that may help prevent the accumulation of corrupted humors that could compromise recovery. But Thomas has also learned that the way treatments are applied can be as important as their chemical properties. Gentle handling of surgical sites, careful attention to cleanliness, and regular monitoring for signs of complications have proven crucial for successful outcomes. The human touch, both literal and metaphorical, seems to contribute significantly to healing in ways that formal medical theory doesn't fully explain. Your wife will need to change these dressings twice daily, Thomas instructs Mrs. Whitehead, demonstrating the proper technique for cleaning and rebandaging surgical wounds. The most important things are gentleness and cleanliness. If you see any signs of unusual redness, swelling, or discharge, send for me immediately. The instruction of family members in patient care represents another dimension of Thomas's plague work that extends well beyond traditional medical practice. He has discovered that patients who receive skilled nursing care from trained family members often recover more successfully than those who depend entirely on periodic visits from physicians. This observation has led Thomas to develop detailed protocols for home nursing care, covering everything from proper nutrition for recovering patients to techniques for preventing bed sores during long periods of confinement. The knowledge he shares with families often proves more valuable than the specific medicines he prescribes, creating a network of trained caregivers throughout the plague-stricken city. As Thomas concludes his afternoon treatments and prepares for his evening rounds, he takes time for one of the most important aspects of his plague work: the careful documentation of cases, treatments, and outcomes that he hopes will contribute to medical knowledge long after the current epidemic ends. His detailed medical journal has grown into a comprehensive record of plague observations that rivals any medical text produced during his university training. Each case receives careful documentation, patient age and general health before infection, symptom progression, treatments attempted, family circumstances that might affect recovery, and detailed notes about outcomes. The journal serves multiple purposes for Thomas's current practice. It allows him to track patterns in his own patients' conditions, identify treatments that seem most effective for different types of cases, and maintain the detailed records that enable him to provide continuity of care during multiple visits to the same families. But Thomas also recognizes that his observations might prove valuable to future physicians who face similar epidemics. The plague has provided him with opportunities to observe disease patterns and treatment outcomes on a scale that would normally require decades of medical practice. This knowledge, carefully recorded and analyzed, might help future healers develop more effective responses to epidemic disease. Patient 127, Jeffrey Whitehead, age 34, merchant. Thomas writes in his careful script: bubonic plague with severe lymph node involvement. Surgical drainage performed on day 6 of illness. Patient tolerated procedure well. Significant quantity of infected material removed. Wound closed with silk sutures, dressed with honey and comfrey poultice. Family instructed in post-operative care. Prognosis cautiously optimistic if infection does not recur. The entry represents Thomas's attempt to balance accurate medical description with the human reality of treating desperate patients with limited knowledge and primitive tools. Each case entry in his journal tells both a medical story and a human story, documenting not just symptoms and treatments, but also the courage, fear, hope, and despair that accompany every plague victim's struggle for survival. Thomas has begun to organize his observations into categories that might prove useful for future analysis. Cases grouped by patient age, symptom patterns, treatment approaches, environmental factors, and outcomes. The resulting database, while small by modern standards, represents one of the most comprehensive collections of plague observations ever assembled by a single physician. If we survive this epidemic, Thomas reflects as he reviews his afternoon's entries, perhaps future physicians will be better prepared to face similar challenges. The knowledge we're gaining at such terrible cost should not be lost when this crisis ends. The documentation process also serves a personal function for Thomas, providing him with a structured way to process the emotional impact of working daily with suffering and death. Writing detailed descriptions of his patients' struggles helps him maintain the professional objectivity necessary for effective medical practice while honoring the human dignity of those he serves. As evening approaches and Thomas prepares for the final phase of his daily rounds, he carries with him not just his medical bag and protective equipment, but also the accumulated knowledge of hundreds of plague cases. Each patient he has treated has contributed to his understanding of the disease, and each treatment he has attempted has added to the slowly growing body of practical knowledge that might eventually help humanity gain the upper hand in its ancient struggle against epidemic disease. The work continues, driven by the simple recognition that someone must tend to the sick, someone must seek better treatments, and someone must bear witness to both the suffering and the courage that define humanity's response to its greatest medical challenges. As the long summer day begins its slow decline toward evening, Thomas makes his way through the increasingly familiar streets of plague-stricken London toward the parish church of St. Giles Cripplegate, where he meets weekly with other community leaders to address the broader health challenges that face their neighborhood. The plague has taught him that effective medical care requires more than treating individual patients. It demands coordinated efforts to protect entire communities from the social and economic disruptions that often prove as deadly as the disease itself. The church stands as one of the few institutions that has maintained normal operations throughout the epidemic, its doors remaining open for both religious services and the secular meetings that help coordinate community survival efforts. Father Michael Hartwell, no relation to the William Hartwell whom Thomas treated this morning, has transformed the church's main hall into an informal headquarters for the volunteer organizations that provide essential services to plague-stricken families. Thomas enters the church to find a scene that would have been unimaginable before the plague crisis transformed London's social structures. Merchants sit alongside laborers, discussing strategies for maintaining food distribution to quarantined households. Wealthy widows coordinate with parish officials to organize charitable assistance for families that have lost their primary breadwinners. Former competitors in various trades work together to ensure that essential services remain available despite the epidemic's disruptions. Dr. Whitmore, Father Hartwell greets him with obvious relief. "We've been hoping you would attend tonight's meeting," Several families have reported illnesses that might not be plague, and we need your advice about whether they require quarantine or can be safely cared for at home. The question illustrates one of the most challenging aspects of community health management during epidemic periods. Not every fever or illness represents plague infection, but distinguishing between plague and other diseases requires medical expertise that most families lack. Mistaken diagnoses can lead to unnecessary quarantine that destroys family finances, while missed plague cases can spread infection throughout entire neighborhoods. Thomas has developed protocols for making these crucial distinctions, but they require careful examination of patients and detailed knowledge of plague symptom patterns. More importantly, they require the trust of families who understand that an incorrect diagnosis might separate them from their livelihoods or, in the worst cases, condemn them to weeks of confinement that could prove fatal if they later develop actual plague symptoms. I can examine any cases where there's uncertainty, Thomas offers, but I think we also need to train more community members to recognize the early signs of plague infection. The sooner we can identify cases, the better our chances of preventing wider spread. The suggestion leads to a discussion about community education programs that could help ordinary citizens become more effective partners in epidemic prevention. Thomas has observed that neighborhoods where residents understand basic principles of disease transmission and early symptom recognition tend to have lower infection rates and better outcomes for those who do become ill. Mary Cooper, a widow whose late husband operated a successful bakery, has emerged as one of the community's most effective organizers. We've been thinking about establishing neighborhood health watchers, she explains. Volunteers who could visit families regularly to check for early signs of illness and provide information about prevention measures. The proposal represents exactly the kind of innovative thinking that Thomas believes offers hope for managing future epidemics more effectively. By training community members to recognize health problems early and respond appropriately, such programs could extend the reach of limited medical resources while creating networks of mutual support that strengthen entire neighborhoods. Thomas's evening duties include one of his most sobering responsibilities, working with parish officials to maintain accurate records of plague deaths that will contribute to the weekly bills of mortality published throughout London. These documents serve multiple purposes. They provide government officials with information needed for policy decisions, help families locate missing relatives, and create historical records that might prove valuable for understanding future epidemics. The work takes place in the church's vestry, where Thomas meets with William Harrison, the parish clerk responsible for recording all deaths within their district. Harrison, a meticulous man whose careful record-keeping has made him invaluable during the plague months, has developed systems for tracking deaths that go far beyond the simple tallies required by city authorities. "We've recorded 43 deaths this week," Harrison reports, consulting the detailed ledgers that contain individual entries for every person who has died within their parish boundaries. 36 are confirmed plague cases, 4 appear to be other diseases, and 3 remain uncertain pending further investigation. The numbers represent more than statistical data to Thomas. Each entry corresponds to a family he knows, a patient he may have treated, a human life cut short by forces beyond medical control. The plague has given him an intimate acquaintance with mortality that few physicians experience, while also teaching him to find meaning in the statistical patterns that might help save future lives. Thomas's role in the record-keeping process involves more than simply confirming cause of death. He provides detailed information about symptom patterns, treatment responses, and environmental factors that might have contributed to each case. This additional data, while not required for official reports, creates a resource that Thomas hopes will prove valuable for future medical research. The pattern this week shows more cases among children under age 10, Thomas observes, studying Harrison's carefully organized entries. That's different from what we saw during the early months of the epidemic, when adult deaths predominated. The observation reflects Thomas's growing understanding that epidemic diseases often change their patterns of infection over time, targeting different age groups or social classes as community conditions evolve. Such patterns, visible only through careful record-keeping across large numbers of cases, might provide crucial insights for developing more effective prevention strategies. Harrison's records also document the social and economic impacts of plague deaths that extend far beyond immediate medical concerns. Families that lose their primary breadwinners face financial ruin that can prove as deadly as disease. Children orphaned by plague deaths become community responsibilities that strain already limited charitable resources. Businesses disrupted by owner deaths create unemployment that affects entire neighborhoods. We're seeing more secondary deaths, Harrison notes, referring to cases where people die not from plague itself, but from the social disruptions that plague creates. Elderly people who can't obtain adequate food because their usual suppliers have fled the city. Infants who can't get proper care because their mothers have died. People with other medical conditions who can't find treatment because physicians are overwhelmed with plague cases. These secondary effects of epidemic disease represent challenges that no individual physician can address alone. They require coordinated community responses that combine medical care with social services, economic support, and the kind of mutual aid networks that can sustain entire populations through extended crises. Thomas has begun documenting these secondary effects in his own records, recognizing that future epidemic responses must address not just disease treatment, but also the broader social disruptions that determine whether communities survive or collapse under the pressure of medical emergencies. As evening deepens and Thomas prepares for his final rounds of the day, he meets with a small group of young men who have volunteered to serve as medical assistants during the plague crisis. These students, some with formal education, others learning through practical experience, represent hope for expanding the city's limited medical resources while training the healers who might face future epidemics. The training takes place in Thomas's own study, where his medical books and equipment provide resources for both theoretical instruction and practical demonstration. But the real education occurs during the daily rounds when students accompany Thomas to observe actual plague cases and learn the skills that no university textbook can teach. Tonight's group includes Robert Fletcher, the 20-year-old son of a cloth merchant who has shown remarkable aptitude for medical work, Sarah Williams, a wise woman whose herbal knowledge has proven invaluable for treating plague symptoms, and James Morton, a former soldier whose steady nerves and strong constitution make him ideal for the physical demands of plague care. The most important thing to understand, Thomas begins, addressing his small class in the same methodical way he approaches patient care, is that we still know very little about this disease. Much of what we do is based on observation and experience rather than proven medical theory. The admission requires considerable humility from a university-trained physician, But Thomas has learned that honest acknowledgement of medical limitations often leads to more effective treatments than adherence to theories that don't match observed reality. His students need to understand both the extent and the limits of current medical knowledge if they are to become effective healers themselves. The evening's lesson focuses on the practical skills that plague work demands, recognizing early symptoms, distinguishing plague from other diseases, applying treatment safely and effectively, and providing the kind of emotional support that often proves as important as medical intervention. Remember that families facing plague are dealing with more than just physical illness. Thomas explains as he demonstrates proper techniques for examining patients while maintaining protective barriers. They're confronting their deepest fears about death, separation, and loss. Sometimes the most important service we can provide is simply the presence of someone who understands their situation and refuses to abandon them. The instruction includes detailed discussion of the protective measures that allow medical workers to serve plague patients without becoming victims themselves. Thomas's own survival through months of plague work provides testimony to the effectiveness of proper precautions, but he emphasizes that such protection requires constant vigilance and absolute adherence to established procedures. The moment you become careless about your own safety, you not only risk your own life, but also threaten every patient you might serve in the future. Thomas warns, a physician who becomes infected helps no one and may actually spread the disease to other patients. Sarah Williams contributes her own expertise about herbal remedies that can supplement formal medical treatments. Her knowledge, gained through years of serving as a neighborhood healer, provides practical insights that complement Thomas's university training while demonstrating the value of combining different healing traditions. Many of the remedies our grandmothers used have real value, Sarah explains as she prepares herbal mixtures that have shown effectiveness in reducing plague symptoms. The important thing is understanding which traditional treatments actually work and which ones might do more harm than good. As Thomas concludes his evening duties and prepares for the night ahead, he takes time for the personal reflection that helps him maintain the emotional balance necessary for his demanding work. The plague has tested every aspect of his character while teaching him lessons about medicine, humanity, and his own resilience that no formal education could have provided. The day's work has included both victories and defeats. Young William Hartwell showed signs of improvement that suggest his treatments are working. Jeffrey Whitehead survived surgical intervention that might save his life. Several families received the supplies and instruction they needed to care for infected members at home. But Thomas also carries the memory of patients beyond his help, families facing tragedies that no medical skill can prevent, and the accumulated weight of witnessing suffering on a scale that challenges his deepest beliefs about divine providence and human purpose. The private journal where Thomas records not just medical observations, but also personal reflections, has become essential for processing the emotional impact of his work. Writing about his experiences helps him maintain the professional objectivity necessary for effective medical practice while honoring the human significance of what he witnesses daily. Today I was reminded again that healing involves more than treating disease. He writes by candlelight in his quiet study. The families I serve need not just medicines, but hope. Not just treatments, but the knowledge that someone cares about their suffering. Sometimes I think the most important medicine I provide is simply the willingness to remain present with people facing their darkest hours. The reflection leads Thomas to consider the broader meaning of his work during these plague months. While he began with the simple goal of treating as many patients as possible, the epidemic has taught him that effective medical care must address not just individual illness, but also the social, economic, and spiritual disruptions that disease creates within communities. His role has evolved far beyond traditional medical practice to include community education, social service coordination, policy consultation, and the kind of human witness that helps preserve dignity and meaning even in the face of overwhelming tragedy. The plague has made him not just a physician, but a community leader whose influence extends throughout the neighborhood he serves. As Thomas extinguishes his candle and prepares for sleep, knowing that emergency calls might interrupt his rest at any hour, he carries with him the quiet satisfaction of work that matters deeply, despite its dangers and limitations. Tomorrow will bring new challenges, new patients, new opportunities to serve families facing their greatest trials. The plague doctor's work continues, driven by the simple recognition that someone must tend to the sick, someone must seek better treatments, and someone must bear witness to both the suffering and the courage that define humanity's response to its greatest challenges. In the darkness of plague-stricken London, Dr. Thomas Whitmore rests briefly before rising again to continue his mission of healing. His strange costume may make him appear inhuman, but his dedication to serving others reveals the most essentially human qualities: compassion, courage, and the refusal to abandon those who need help most desperately. As you drift toward peaceful sleep, dear listener, carry with you the memory of these remarkable healers who risked everything to bring comfort and hope to families facing their darkest hours. Their story reminds us that true heroism often wears unexpected disguises, that the greatest courage sometimes appears in the most frightening forms, and that human compassion can shine brightest during our species' most challenging times. The plague doctors whose lives we have shared tonight sleep now in history's gentle embrace, but their legacy lives on in every medical worker who chooses service over safety, in every healer who brings hope to the hopeless, and in every person who refuses to turn away from suffering that they might help alleviate. Sweet dreams, gentle souls, may you rest peacefully under the protection of those who understand that the highest calling is not to seek comfort for ourselves, but to bring comfort to others when they need it most. If this journey into medicine's heroic past has brought you peace or inspiration, I'd be honored if you'd subscribe for more gentle explorations of history's hidden heroes. Next week, we'll discover the truth about medieval torture, separating historical reality from Hollywood myths in our continuing quest to understand the full complexity of human experience. Until then, sleep well in the knowledge that throughout history, brave souls have chosen compassion over comfort, service over safety, and hope over despair. Their courage lights the way for all who follow. Good night, and may your dreams be filled with the gentle presence of healers who never abandon their calling, no matter how dark the night may seem.